That's all I care about.
Einstein says everything is relative.
I don't want you jiggling me.
All right.
Okay? Welcome to all of you who have come tonight. It's good to see such a good crowd. Hope you enjoyed the movie. Now, I'm only going to do this one time out of the 10 movies. I'm not going to go through a bio all 10 times because most of you know our favorite rabbi. So I'll just do a briefie tonight. Michael Panitz was ordained as a rabbi in 1982. He has served as Rabbi of Temple Israel in Norfolk since 1992. He's been an adjunct professor of religious studies at William and Mary, Virginia Wesleyan, and Old Dominion. For the past decade, he has served as Rabbi in residence at Christ and St. Luke Church, that's an Episcopal church, in Norfolk. We know Rabbi Michael as the Chesapeake's favorite rabbi, and we're always happy to interact with him. Tonight he will lecture on the movie Masada. Now, this is a little screwy because the timing isn't quite right, and you'll have more from the rabbi and from the chaplain about the times here. The next movie will be shown, get the date, Wednesday, October 15th, followed by the lecture on Tuesday, October 21st. That movie will be Ivanhoe. Now, we're going to enjoy ourselves. There are some chairs up here, folks. If anyone needs chairs up here in the front. 4. There's a whole table right here, so just come on up and sit down and enjoy. And welcome.
Thank you very much. Well chosen words, thank you. Good evening, friends.
Good evening.
How nice to be together again. I want to reassure you the fact that you're sitting at tables does not mean that there will be a quiz at the end of tonight. Since this is the first meeting of the programming year, I'm going to recite a benediction, which in the Jewish tradition is recited when we do something for the first time ever or for the first time in a given year. And I'll say it in Hebrew and then of course I'll translate it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechayanu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe. You have kept us alive, you have sustained us, and you have allowed us to reach this moment. Amen. Amen. Of course, I do know that some of our longtime members have finished their earthly course, and hopefully they are now in a place of bliss. And, just take a moment of silence to remember those who were part of this group and now are perhaps watching from the heavenly gallery. As we say in Hebrew, Yehi Zichram Baruch, may their memory endure as a blessing. Amen. Amen. Now, friends, this is the beginning of a new series, the series of 10 films and 10 lectures. You might know that in years past, thanks to the generosity of the, we call it LifeSpire, correct?
Yes.
LifeSpire, I've been able to come and give 5 lectures. Thanks to a very generous anonymous donor, that has been doubled. So we're going to have 10 films and 10 lectures this season. One a month from now through June. So we're going to have a lot of time to think about the subject at hand, which is a cinematic traversal of Jewish history. We've chosen 10 different films that speak about aspects of the experience of the Jewish people through time. Not counting the biblical period, because we've already spent some time looking at movies that are retellings of Bible stories, but starting from the experience of Jewish people under Roman rule 2,000 years ago, and continuing up to virtually the present day. 2 films are set in long ago. Tonight's film, and tonight was a different kind of film, I'll get to that in a moment, set in ancient times, specifically the years 70 through 73 of the Common Era, so almost 2,000 years ago. And the next film is set in England at the time of the Third Crusade, just around the year 1190 or 1195. And next month is an adaptation of the famous novel by Sir Walter Scott, Ivanhoe, starring 2 of the great film stars of half a century ago, Robert Taylor and the impossibly beautiful Elizabeth Taylor. But beyond that, our films will be exploring topics from the 19th and 20th centuries up till virtually the present day. So really our focus will be on modern experience. Now, tonight's film differs from all the others in that we watched a documentary instead of a feature film. It's not that we didn't have a feature film to show, but we made an executive decision that you might not want to sit through 8 hours of film. We thought that 8 hours might be more than one can tolerate. There was another option too, because those 8 hours are subdivided into four shows. We could have watched just the last, but it's so difficult to come in the last quarter of something and try to understand it all. So if anyone is motivated to want to see the entire Masada mini-series, please be in touch with our chaplain, Uwe Scharf, and we'll see what we can do. But for now, though, I'm going to be keying my remarks from the documentary that we watched and giving you the historical context. So because this is the first session, I'm going to make a few general introductory remarks. When we think about the history of a given group, we often think about people who live in a particular place, their ancestors lived in that place, their descendants live in that place. And that's typically what we do. If we were doing a history of France, we'd be talking about the people who made up the ancestral population of France and what happened to people living there in ancient times, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, and the early modern era. We would talk about the French Revolution, we talk about Napoleon, and so on and so forth, all the way up to Macron today. And it would be people living in their place. That's not the appropriate lens for the study of Jewish history, for the simple reason that the Jewish people were forcibly exiled from our homeland and only allowed to return to our homeland in the last century or so. And one of the themes of the films at the end of our, nearer to the end of our series, is the Jewish people returns home again. That's what Zionism is about. That's what the rebirth of the state of Israel is about. Only 3/4 of a century ago. But for most of Jewish history, the Jewish people were in exile. They were not in their homeland. And in a sense, tonight's conversation begins that process of Jewish people being exiled from their homeland, never ceasing to wish and pray for their restoration, but not able to accomplish it for well nigh 2,000 years. So Jewish history involves the study of a people who were forcibly dispersed. That's one of the main features of the Jewish experience. The second feature we need to keep in mind is if they didn't have the same place and they weren't speaking the language of that place, and they weren't in fact the majority culture of that place, how did they stay one people? Why were French Jews, German Jews, Russian Jews, Moroccan Jews, etc., why were they all Jews and not Moroccans, French, etc., who happened to have a particular religion? What about their experience kept them one people? And we're going to be thinking about that as well. And we're going to see how strong a unifying factor the common religion was for the Jewish people when coupled by the fact that wherever they lived, they were a minority by virtue of that religion. So their identity was, in a sense, strengthened by some of the difficulties that they endured. So those are some of the basic themes that we'll be exploring about Jewish history. Our subject now deals with the Jews living in their homeland, but not enjoying self-rule. They are ruled over, and ruled over rather harshly, by the Roman Empire. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history for context that goes beyond what you saw in the documentary, and it'll help make the documentary make sense. Jewish people first returned to the land of Israel from the Babylonian exile on account of the decree of the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great. And we know this from the Bible. This is about 500 years before the beginning of the Christian era. Cyrus conquered Babylonia, and as one of his decrees, as the Persian emperor, he allowed the Judeans, the Jews, to go home to Jerusalem, rebuild their house of the Lord, restart their sacrifices there, and of course also offer sacrifices asking God for the welfare of their emperor. So we may have thought of Cyrus as a very generous man, but we should recognize that at relatively low expense he was purchasing supplemental insurance. Because not only did he have his Zoroastrian priests taking care of his welfare, but now he had the Jews as well, praying to their God for his welfare. So it was very canny on his part. And some of the Jewish people remained in Babylon. Many of them went back to Israel and continued to live there. 2 centuries go by, and the Persians themselves are conquered by another people, the Greeks. Now, the conquest of the Middle East by the Greeks was not only political, it was also cultural. The Greeks were very proud of their national accomplishment. In fact, I'll give you one word to show you how chauvinistic the Greeks were in thinking about their glorious civilization versus other people. The Greek word for someone who speaks Greek is to speak Greek is Hellenidzēn. That's why a Hellenist is a Greek, a Hellenistic civilization. What do you think is the Greek word for people who do not speak Greek? In their language, what is the word for don't speak Greek? The answer is barbaroi. Barbaroi. barbarians. So if you're speaking Greek, your word for people who don't speak Greek is, they're barbarians. So already, even from that one word, you get a sense that Greeks are very proud of their culture, their civilization. And in fact, there was a lot to be proud about. They are the inventors of the discipline of philosophy. They are among the pioneers of the political experiment of democracy. So there's a lot that the Greeks could be proud of. You might not like this so much, but they also created geometry. If ever you sweated over the Pythagorean theorem, you can thank the Greeks for that. By the way, today is Pythagorean theorem day. Why? I will tell you. This has nothing to do with Masada, but I will tell you. Today is the 9th month, right? The 16th day and the 25th year of the century. 9, 16, 25. 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared. 9, 16, 25. As you know, the Pythagorean theorem tells you about right triangles, that the sum of the square of the two sides equals the sum of the hypotenuse. So if you have a right triangle and one side is 3 whatever, meters or feet or inches or whatever, and the next one is 4, the hypotenuse will be the square root of 5 squared. In other words, it will be 5. So 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared, 9, 16, 25, the only day of our entire century, which will be a Pythagorean day like that. So enjoy the day. I think it's worth an extra cup of Moose Track ice cream or something. Okay, so the Greeks were very proud of their scientific and philosophical and cultural accomplishments, and Christians know this from something that you may not think about, but when you think about it, you realize it. The Hebrew Testament, by definition, is written in Hebrew, right? The Old Testament is written in Hebrew. Some of it's in Aramaic. What language is the New Testament written in? Greek. Why is that? Because Greek had taken over as the language of culture in that region. So the Jewish people were accustomed to having other people ruling over them and being very proud of what they brought to the equation. Now, the Greeks themselves were conquered in the 100s, before the Common Era, by this up-and-coming city-state called Rome. Rome had been just a city in the middle of Italy, but very bellicose, very aggressive towards its neighbors, fighting its neighbors, conquering its neighbors. Ultimately, it conquered all of the Italian peninsula, and it ended up squaring off against a very important empire that was based in North Africa, based in the city of Carthage, which would be modern-day Tunisia, and it was called Carthage. And there were 3 wars that the Romans fought against the Carthaginians. Carthaginians had a magnificently able general. You may remember this from high school history classes, Hannibal. And remember that he pioneered using elephants as war animals, and he actually crossed the Alps with elephants. By the way, is anyone here a football fan? Okay. Do you remember the great quarterback Johnny Unitas? Okay. I want to tell you the funniest recollection I have from my 9th grade ancient history class. You're going to like this. What does it mean in football when it's a quote-unquote 3rd and long? Could you help us understand that? There's 4 downs, right? And you have to get 10 yards for a first down. So if it's a 3rd down and you got a long way to go, the full 10 or even more, that's called 3rd and long. Okay. So my 9th grade history teacher asked the class a question on a test: who crossed the Alps with elephants? And of course, the right answer is Hannibal. We had a class clown, a guy named Mikey, You can tell that if someone has that nickname, he's probably the class clown. And he didn't know the answer, so he said, Johnny Unitas on a third and long. Across the Alps with elephants. Anyway, so the Romans ultimately defeated this formidable foe. Now they are the masters of the entire Western Mediterranean, and then they turned eastward. Initially, they were a little bit shy about going up against the Greeks. The Greeks had a formidable military reputation, going back to Alexander the Great. But the Romans figured out how to defeat them as well. And over the course of the 100s, the Romans took over all of Greece too. So now they're a huge state, spanning from Spain to Turkey, on the northern shores of the Mediterranean, and North Africa on the southern shores of the Mediterranean. It's a big, big state. It wasn't enough for them. One of their top generals, a man named Pompey Magnus, Big Pompey, Pompey Magnus, went to the land of Israel in the year 63 before the Common Era, because two of the Jewish pretenders for the throne were having a debate over who should be the king. They were both descendants of the famous Maccabees, that dynasty of Jewish rulers. And Pompey said, I will arbitrate. Each of you bring your case before me, and I'll determine who should be the next king of the Jews. They each did that, and Pompey said, you're wrong. And you're wrong too. I'm the king of the Jews. And Rome took over the Jewish state. It was almost bloodless. There was a little bit of resistance by one of the Maccabees, but the Romans took over. At first, they ruled through a client king, which gets us to our documentary. The client king they used was Herod. Remember the name Herod? Herod. So he had been one of these Jewish aristocrats raised in Rome as part of the diplomatic world of that era, and he served the Roman interests as their client king. He didn't make any important decision that they didn't agree with. But there was a kind of a nominal independence that the Jewish people had under Herod. Herod also tried to get their goodwill by doing some fantastic building projects. Herod rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, and he made a McMansion out of it. Zerubbabel's temple was a small affair, unpretentious. Herod turned it into one of the wonders of the ancient world. The only thing left standing of that temple today is a retaining wall on the western side of the plaza that held the temple. That's called the Western Wall. In Christian tradition, it's called the Wailing Wall, because Jewish people would go there once a year, they still go there, on the anniversary of when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. I'm going to come to that shortly. And they would cry, they would lament. So it's called the Wailing Wall, Klagenmauer, the Wailing Wall. So Herod also built a state-of-the-art harbor in the administrative capital of Caesarea, so that there could be effective commercial relations. He funded all of this by a very canny political decision. After the assassination of Julius Caesar, you've heard about that, right? He's assassinated in the Forum on March 15th of the year 44. And remember, his friend Brutus was one of the senators who stabbed him. Do you remember what he said when he saw Brutus? A tu, Brute, right? You too, Brutus? Right. And then he died. So after that, there was a civil war in Rome between the two people who wanted to become the emperor. One of them was Mark Antony, successful general, friend of Caesar's, and the paramour of the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. And he lost. Octavian, who's known as Augustus, won that civil war, became the became the emperor. In order to punish Cleopatra's, well, she was dead already, but to punish Egypt and to reward Herod for his loyalty, Augustus gave Herod the revenues from the date palm plantations of Jericho. Now, date palms were a serious cash crop back then. In fact, a common misconception that probably goes back to the King James Bible is that in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, verse 8, when it describes Israel as a land flowing with milk and honey. Do you know that expression? The common misconception is that we're thinking about bee honey. But we're not. The honey of the Bible is date sap, date syrup, the syrup that you get from crushing dates. You can buy it in a specialty grocery store, or one that it's called Whole Foods in Norfolk. Do you know that store? Yeah, I call it Whole Paycheck. Well, one look at the prices and you'll know why. So it's called Silan, S-I-L-A-N. That is the honey of the Bible. It's really date sap. So when Herod was given that enormous cash crop of the date palm plantations of Jericho, he used the revenue to fund all sorts of building projects. One of the building projects is what we saw in our documentary. He built this fortress overlooking the Dead Sea, and it's called Masada, which gets us much closer to our main story. Herod built a string of such fortresses so that he would never be too far from one of them if he had to escape and needed sanctuary. Because while Herod strove to be popular with the people, he knew that ultimately he wasn't. And are you paranoid if they really do hate you? He was also a bit paranoid, it's true. And he wanted to have a safe haven that was never too far out of arm's reach. But Masada was the crown jewel of his string of fortresses. It was nearly inaccessible, so once you were there, it would be very hard for anyone to attack you. There was a little winding path that goes up to the top of this, it's like a mesa. It's like a mountain with a flat top. And he had a very impressive palace built on that top of the mesa. Then he had another palace built a little ways down on the side that you had to descend by a special stairwell rather, to get there. That was his private palace. But the public palace is the big one on the top of the tabletop mountain. And he did it in ways that IKEA could only dream about. The frescoes, the mosaic floors, no artistic expense was spared to make it the top of 1st century BCE fashion. You could get hot water in your bath by a very ingenious system. Now, you may not think of that as being very exciting in the year 2025, but in the year -25, that would have been very exciting to get hot water in your bath. He had a whole system for that. So it was an engineering marvel as well as an art treasure. Now, after Herod's death, we don't have a very strong historical record about how it was used. It was a place for a small contingent of Roman soldiers who could use the observation posts that it afforded to see caravans going hither and yon, coming towards Jerusalem from the south. It certainly wasn't in the center of anything, so it wasn't a large army force. It was a small army force there. Now, to go back to the main story of the Romans ruling over the Jewish people, it was a difficult situation. How did you get to be a Roman governor of Judea? We're talking about a very corrupt organization. Basically, you bribed your way up the imperial chain to get the emperor to appoint you to be the procurator of the Holy Land. You know the most famous one, Pontius Pilate. You know him from the New Testament account. He stayed in that position over 10 years, which was longer than most, because he was very efficient at doing two things. Number one, bringing in the taxes. That was the first thing that they had to do. Number two, sniffing out any possible hint of rebellion and dealing with it before it could become a blaze. That's why, in the gospel account, what he says to Jesus, who's brought before him, is, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He's not interested in theology, he's interested in politics. Do you represent a political threat to me and to Roman rule? That's what he was interested in. And he did not give defendants the benefit of the doubt. He didn't think they had to be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. As far as he was concerned, if he wasn't totally convinced of their innocence, he would just as soon put them to death. A very brutal man. And the others were like that too. Eventually, their greed, their rapaciousness was so great that the Jews couldn't take it anymore. I'll tell you one moment which is very dramatic, where there was almost a rebellion, but it was finally put down. Did you know there was an emperor named Caligula? Caligula was the emperor after Tiberius. So in other words, it's about a few years after Jesus of Nazareth. He was most likely insane. He was also a sociopath, and he was he believed that he was a god, not just after he dies. He believes a god right now, and he wanted to have a statue worshiping him as a god put into the Jerusalem temple. That would have sparked a revolt right then and there. But he was so obnoxious to his own people. For example, he would steal the wives of senators and have his will upon them. You know, he'd invite the senators and their wives to a banquet, and he would, perform an outrage upon the wife right there. And he created so many enemies that finally he was assassinated. His own bodyguards assassinated him. That's how much he was hated. Think about that. Imagine if your own Secret Service turns on you. And they, according to the story that we have from Roman history, the person they selected didn't want to be emperor because he was a good man. His name was Claudius. They found him hiding behind a curtain. They put him out, took him out from the curtain, lifted him on their shoulders, these German-speaking Praetorian guards, and they hail him as Imperator, Imperator, and Claudius becomes the emperor. There's a very fine TV series from about 1980 called I, Claudius, which tells that story. And you could still watch it. I'm sure it's still available. Based on the novels of Robert Graves, very fine British novelist. So Claudius immediately sends out a cancellation of Caligula's order. And the question is, which order is going to reach the shore of the land of Israel first? Because, they're in these galleys where they have people rowing, and one ship has the order that will spark a rebellion, put up a statue of Caligula in the temple in Jerusalem. The other one has the new emperor, Claudius, countermanding that. I would not have wanted to be one of the slaves rowing on Claudius's ship, because they had to make up for lost time. Otherwise, there would have been a whole war breakout. Anyway, Claudius's ship, although it launched second, it arrived first, and that's what prevented there from being a Jewish revolt 25 years before it actually broke out. But it did break out in the year 66. The Romans dispatched one of their top generals, a man known as Vespasian. He shows up in our documentary, to put down the revolt. And he gathers his troops and he marches from the north into the northern part of the land of Israel, which the section called the Galilee. And he defeats it. He pacifies it. One of the commanders of the Jews who surrendered to him was a commander named Josephus. Yosef, son of Matityahu. Josephus is the Greek of his name. He surrenders to Vespasian, and he somehow sweet talks Vespasian. Vespasian takes him into his entourage. But then Vespasian is recalled to Rome for the following reason. The emperor has died. The emperor was Nero. Do you remember that name? Nero? Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Do you remember that? He certainly didn't fiddle because they didn't have fiddles then. But he may have played the lute, for accompanying himself in a sad song, because he fancied himself a Emmy Award-winning thespian. And of course, every time he went to one of these Greek, places which had contests, of course he won. Are you going to give the Emperor Nero anything but the laurel for the first place? And he actually believed it. So I could say he got everything except the Nobel Peace Prize. But anyway, he was very, very upset that Rome burned. Of course these cities burned. They didn't have any effective firefighting. They had bucket brigades. So the city burned. He was weeping. When he died in the year 67, there are 3 different Roman generals who are duking it out over who's going to be the next emperor. So the attempt to put down the Jewish revolt was put on hold. And so the Jewish rebels who were living in Jerusalem continued to rule there. They minted coins. They were functionally independent for a little bit of time. A group of the Jews went down to Masada and snuck up it's called the Snake Path, and overpowered the Roman garrison there. Because there were very few soldiers there, because it was not a place of high strategic importance. And then we know nothing about the Jews who were there until the end of the failed war of independence. Apparently they were just waiting there. We think that they thought that the end of days was about to come, that God would come down and, Deus ex machina, God would destroy the Romans the way God had helped Judah Maccabee to defeat the numerically superior Greeks, the way God had intervened to destroy Pharaoh with all his chariots. The Jews who captured Masada thought that God would come down and help them too. That's not what happened. So they're there, apparently just sitting things out. And in Rome, the situation has now sorted itself out, and Vespasian becomes the emperor. So he sends his son, Titus, to lead the army and go back to Israel and finish putting down the revolt. And that's what Titus did. But now we're talking about the years 69 and 70. Titus resumes the operations. Remember, at this time in its history, the Roman army was nearly invincible. Their battle tactics, their engineering abilities, their lines of communication, the fact that they had all these roads that you could march on, they could move men and supplies quickly from place to place. There was no other power in the world that could match them. The Persian Empire could maybe fight them to a draw. And so there was typically a truce between the Parthians and the Romans, but sometimes one of them won, sometimes the other, but typically the Romans won everything. And they're winning in Judah as well, because while they are impassioned, the Judeans were simply not a match for the Romans. So all the other places in Judea get captured, not Masada. Masada is down in the desert, except for Jerusalem. Jerusalem is where the rebels retreat to, and the Romans start a siege of Jerusalem. Now, the siege is characterized by the Romans lobbing huge, heavy stones against the walls of the city. They had these stone throwers, ancient era howitzers, if you will. And eventually the Romans broke through the city walls, and the fighting was desperate, continued for about 3 weeks. When they get to the middle of the summer, the 9th day of Av, the Romans are up to the temple itself. Titus has a council of war and decides to burn it, destroy it. It says, because this is the symbol of Jewish resistance. If we destroy this symbol of Jewish resistance, we can bring an end to their resistance completely. So the Romans destroyed the temple deliberately on the same day as the Babylonians had destroyed it all those years before. And they killed innumerable numbers of Jewish defenders. They kidnapped and sold into slavery many, many, many others. Those Jews were taken to Rome. They were sold in slave markets. They built the Colosseum. If you've been to Rome and you've seen the Colosseum, that was built by Jewish slave labor. Something to keep in mind. The Romans were very happy with Titus because he'd won their war for them. They erected an arch, which you can still see in Rome to this day, Arch of Titus. And I want to share with you a personal story. In the year 1982, my wife and I were in Rome. We were there with my parents, who were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary by staying in Rome for the summer. And we had our 1-year-old daughter. And on the 9th day of Av, the anniversary of the destruction of the temple, I thought I should go to the Arch of Titus. So I went there, and I mean, it's like as far as I was concerned, it's like a monument to Hitler. You know, this is the man who destroyed our temple and killed so many of my ancestors. So I said to him some unkind words, and I finished by saying, Am Yisrael Chai. The people of Israel still lives. The Senate and the people of Rome are no longer, an independent state, but the Jewish people are still here. Anyway, so I thought that I was doing something new, but there's nothing new under the sun. That was 1982. 10 years later, my steps lead me to Norfolk, Virginia, where we settle, my wife, and now we have 3 children, and I will settle in Norfolk, where Sheila and I still live with Emily, and I take up my work as the Rabbi of Temple Israel, as Judy told you. And it turns out that my cantor, my music minister, is an Israeli veteran. He was a sergeant in the Israeli army in the original Israel War of Independence in 1948. And before that, he was a soldier in something called the Jewish Brigade, who fought as part of the British Army against the Nazis in the Italian front. So Cantor Danker told me that no matter how many times the Italian authorities tried to clean off the Arch of Titus, there was always some graffiti there in Hebrew, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel still lives. So apparently I didn't make this up. It was an idea long before me. Now, once the Jerusalem temple was destroyed, there was only the matter of the Romans mopping up isolated pockets of resistance. And Masada was the last such pocket, because as I explained to you, its location was nearly impregnable. The only way that the Jewish people themselves took it was by surprise, but there was no surprising the Jewish garrison. There was a war going on. They knew the Romans might show up, and if you're on the top of the mesa there, you can see for miles and miles and miles. No one can sneak up on you if it's a large army. So the Romans got there, and they began to besiege Masada. They built a circumference wall so that no one could go in or out. We still have the archaeological footprints of their army camps. When you're on the top of Masada and you look down, you see the rectangles of their army camps. They had many soldiers to work for them. They had many slaves, and they built an earth ramp to lead up from the base of the mountain up to the top of the mountain. And when the ramp was completed, they had one of their siege engines, which is like a wagon, which is covered for protection, and which has a battering ram. And they began to batter the walls of the fortress down. Now, the defenders came up with an ingenious emergency wall. They took earth and logs, and they made an earth emergency wall behind the stone wall that had been cracked. And as you know, if you take a battering ram against stone, you can crack it. But if you take it against earth, you're just going to pack it. You're not going to be able to crack it. So the battering ram was defeated, so the Romans decided to burn it because it was logs as well. So they started a big fire, and then the wind changed, and the fire burned the attacking army and not the fortification. But then the wind changed again, and it burned up the fortification. By now it's the very end of a day of fighting. The Romans have gone back down the ramp. They're intending to go up and in and massacre everybody the next day. Now, the only source that we have contemporary with the events was written by that Jewish general whose name was Josephus. Told you about that. Josephus went to work for Vespasian. He became like a PR agent for him. Vespasian gave him a villa to live in, and Josephus took Vespasian's family name, Flavius. Vespasian was called the Flavian emperor because Flavius was his own family name. So Josephus takes the same name as if to say he's an adopted son of Vespasian. So he's writing this history of the Jewish war, celebrating Vespasian and Vespasian's son Titus. They're the ones who write this paycheck. But Josephus also had his own agenda that wasn't against his working for the Flavians, but was tangential to it. Josephus wanted to make the point that the defenders of Masada failed because, as he understood it, God was angry with the Jewish people for its sins. The same way as the prophet Jeremiah explained and the prophet Ezekiel explained the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians in terms of God is almighty and God will punish even his chosen people if they've sinned. Josephus applied that to this as well. So the whole business about the fire burning the siege machine of the Romans and then the wind changes, in Josephus's hands, that's a way of saying God wasn't going to allow them to succeed. And we just need to reckon with that. Their time had not come. Maybe the Jewish people needs to repent. Maybe that's why. But in the process, Josephus gave us the only account of the siege and reduction of Masada. The most dramatic part is what comes next. According to Josephus, it's the nighttime. In the next morning, the defenders know that the Romans are going to come in and, in all likelihood, violate all the women, murder all the men, and then take the women and the children into slavery. There's not going to be any clemency. And the defenders decide to kill themselves first and not let the Romans do that. So according to Josephus, the next morning dawns, The Romans come up expecting to have a jolly old time, killing their defenders and having their way with their women, and then getting a lot of slaves to sell in the slave market, and eerie silence. They go from room to room on the top of the mesa, nothing. Finally, they realize they're all dead. It's just that there were 2 or 3 women who just, life was too precious. They weren't willing to do that. They were hiding in a cave. They came out and told the Romans the story of what had happened. That's the Josephus account. When Jews came back to Israel in the early 1900s, Masada became a symbol for them of, we lost our independence 2,000 years ago, we're going to regain it, Masada will not fall again. One of the great Israeli poets of the 1920s, named Yitzhak Lamdan, wrote a poem called Masada, and that's where the idea came that Masada shall not fall again. That gripped the Israeli psyche the same way that Remember the Alamo has gripped the American psyche. Well, the Alamo, ultimately was a Mexican victory, right? The American defenders were massacred. Was it Sam Houston, I think? Right? Well, he got a city named after himself, at least. So think of Masada as the Israeli Alamo. It became a national symbol. When any Israeli army recruit finished his basic training, the last assignment of basic training is to march up that steep hill, not easy, and then to take your oath on the top of the mountain. I take my oath as a member of the Israel Defense Forces that Masada shall not fall again. They don't do it anymore because it's 75 years after the beginning of the state. Psychologically, they're not in the same place, but that's a very large part of the psyche of Israel in its early years. Now, did it happen as Josephus said? Well, I'm going to give you a definite maybe. On the one hand, historians in the ancient world didn't try to give journalistic accuracy. They were writing entertainment. And part of the entertainment values was stirring speeches by the generals. For example, do you know the speech given to Constantine before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which is a very important battle after which Christianity became legalized in the Roman Empire? I don't know if you ever heard about this. He says to his soldiers, "Up in the sky, I've seen the symbol of a cross, and I've seen the words, in hoc vincere." In other words, in this sign will you win, will you vanquish the enemy. I don't know, when I see it writing up in the sky, it's usually at the beach, ocean front, and it says something like, "Marry me, Susie," or "Circus is coming to town," or "Haynes has a sale, the best sale ever." That's what I see when I look up in the sky. But when Constantine looked up in the sky, he saw "in hoc vincere." Right? So is that what he really saw? Is it the way historians wrote their craft back then? Right? Who knows? Mi odea. On the other hand, I don't think that Josephus could have gotten away with more of a lie than Vespasian and Titus would have tolerated, because they were his bosses, and Titus was there. So I tend to think that Josephus's account, while it's not provable, arguably that's as close as we'll ever know to what really happened. Intriguingly enough, the archaeologists found potsherds in the top of the mountain where the Jewish defenders were, and one of them had the name of the commander of that group, Ben Yair. Was this the drawing of lots that Josephus describes, for them to decide who's going to kill the others and then fall on his sword and take his own life? Again, as I say, it's a definite maybe. Or maybe it was just, their lottery system for, who draws duty this night, or who gets the extra potato, or whatever it might be. We'll never know, but it is so intriguing. So to pull this all together, Masada represents the end of ancient times and the beginning of the long centuries of the Middle Ages for the Jewish people. In ancient times, we were typically living under some other ruler, often in our own land, but we were still hoping to have some measure of independence. After Masada, most Jews recognize that it's impossible. Until God decides that the long centuries of the exile will end, all we can do is outlast them. We can't defeat them. So when another rebel arose about 60 years later, Bar Kokhba, some were attracted to his cause. Most of the rabbis said, don't jump on that bandwagon. It'll just lead to many unnecessary deaths. The thing to do about the Romans is outlast them. If they will let you practice your religion, do that. And as a very famous Jewish person from Nazareth said with respect to a coin, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. That was not despite the context of the gospel narratives, that was not a point of issue between Jesus and the rabbis. They both agreed on that we have no alternative but to pay obedience to Rome right now. But the day will come when Rome is not here, and we still are. That's what I said to Titus, at his arch in 1982, a mere 1910 years after the arch had been built. The Roman Empire in the West was abolished by a barbarian king in the year 476, and we're still here. But we got a lot more history to go, so starting next month, we'll be looking at that too. Questions? Sir?
How wide was the Roman siege ramp? Could you march 2 or 3 or 5 going up it? Or?
Yes. You could pull up a siege engine up it. And a siege engine was a wagon with pulleys and ropes and a battering ram, and you need a whole platoon of soldiers to work that ram. And then behind that you have more companies. So yeah, it's a big ramp. But remember, they had unlimited labor and plenty of earth to work with. Good question, thank you. Sir?
Who was the king after Herod?
Okay, so here the Romans allowed some of the Jewish territories to have children of Herod as king. One's name was Antipas. I remember when I studied this in graduate school, I thought it was very funny that Antipasta would have a king named after it, but his name was Herod Antipas. But in Judea itself, the Romans didn't allow any kings, and they had what they called their procurators. So that's where Pontius Pilate comes into the story.
And we have questions. We have a second microphone, so if you would raise your hand and I will come with a microphone. And
there we go,
say your name.
On this side.
And I see 2 people right here, starting with you, so that everybody can hear your question as well as the answer.
My name is Roger. One of the movie series showed the Essenes got involved. Did they have anything occur that made them famous forever?
Yes, the Essenes are one of the sects that Josephus describes as being part of the Jewish people at that time. So what do we mean by a sect? It's a subdivision of the Jewish community who feel very strongly that they're right and the other Jews just get it wrong. Now, we have that today too, right? And we have it in the Christian world also, I dare say. I wouldn't go into that church, right? That's the church I don't go into, right? I'm sure you know people like that too, right? So the Essenes, as best we know, practiced a kind of an ascetic lifestyle. They felt that the big city was a place of corruption. They may have even felt that the Jerusalem temple had been corrupted by its big city environment. They wanted to go out into the austerity of the desert. We believe that the settlement up the road from Masada, in a place called Qumran, Qumran, was an Essene settlement. That place is very famous because in 1947, in the caves there, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Now, one of the intriguing possibilities, it's a possibility, it's not for sure, but maybe, is that John the Baptizer, I don't call him John the Baptist because he didn't go to a Baptist church, but John the Baptizer may have spent some time there. Or that could be connected with his own spiritual journey. So it's intriguing. We wish we could know more, of course.
I understand why.
We're taking everyone's name first.
Pardon me?
Your name, sir.
Who are you? Your name. Who are you? My name's Bill.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. I understand why the people disliked the Jews back in Roman times. I don't understand why they dislike them still now in Israel, why there's so much fighting and so many people that just dislike them. And I don't understand why.
I think that for so much of Jewish history, Jewish people represent something convenient for other people to dislike. Communists call Jews capitalists. Capitalists call Jews communists, and so on and so forth. In the case of what's going on in Israel, there's a whole difficult political situation based on the following, and I'll try and give a long lecture compressed into a paragraph or two. The founder of the religion of Islam, Muhammad, created his version of monotheism with a militant edge to it. The world should be invited to submit to the understanding that there is one God, as Muhammad teaches, but if they won't submit, then we go and we conquer them. That's in the Quran. You find it in Surah number 5 and Surah number 9 and so on and so forth. And in particular, the previous communities of monotheists, the Christians and the Jews, they can be on the back of the bus in our society, but only in the back because they have an inferior understanding of monotheism. They don't have the latest, they don't have Windows 11.0. Right? They're dealing with an older Windows. So what that means in practice is that Christians and Jews shouldn't have any independent country in our part of the world. So the mere fact that Israel is an independent Jewish state is already reason for the fundamentalists of the Muslim world to say perpetual war against them. Everything else is window dressing. That's the bottom line reason. It's not about Gaza because they say from the river to the sea is what Palestine should be. There shouldn't be any Israel at all. So that what's going on right now, which is very, very sad, is in some ways a continuation of what's been going on for 76 years, unfortunately. But thank you for the question.
Other questions or comments?
Over here.
Yeah, very good.
State your name first.
Yes, I want to question you,
Tell us your name.
Alice.
Thank you, Alice.
I'll question you about why the Jews didn't accept Jesus. And you flipped, I wasn't sure whether you told me the truth or not. You said they were waiting for a king.
Waiting for a what?
A king.
A king.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, they were waiting for a restoration of sovereignty. Think about David, for example, King David. King David has his head anointed with oil by the prophet Samuel. And he does something that no previous Israelite leader had been able to do. He defeated the Philistines, and he made the Israelites independent of the Philistines. He restored them to their free condition in their land. He captured Jerusalem at long last, gave it to them as their national capital. So that set the bar for what Jewish people expected the Messiah to do. So they were waiting for a king. They were waiting for someone who would free them from the Romans. And as Christianity developed, the idea was the first coming frees you from sin, the power of sin over you. The second coming is when nation shall not lift up sword against nation. That notion of a first coming and a second coming was not a Jewish notion of those days. It's a notion that was nurtured and developed within Christian consciousness. So that's the answer to why Jews felt that what they were looking for is not what they were seeing. Thank you.
All right, okay, over there.
It is interesting that...
Is it Bob? Bob?
Bob,
I thought so, yes.
interesting that a highly placed Jewish rabbi, maybe not a rabbi, but he was very highly placed in the Jewish faith, became friends with the Romans.
You mean Josephus?
Wrote the most about Masada and that time that he lived in, and has left us with quite a bit of information about.
Josephus was a priest. He was a priestly family, and he was at one point of the political party Pharisee, although that no longer characterized him at the end. He was a military commander, and his unit was defeated by Vespasian's army back in 67 at the beginning of the revolt. So he surrendered, and he managed to sweet-talk his way into Vespasian's consciousness. The story is that he foretold to Vespasian that Vespasian would become the next emperor. And when Vespasian is trying to figure out whether to just kill him right away or kill him tomorrow, he gets word that the Emperor Nero has died. So he's thinking, maybe this guy's onto something. It's a very dramatic story. And of course, Josephus knew how to tell a dramatic story. So anything that Josephus tells you, you got to remember he's a good storyteller.
We have time for one or maximum 2 additional questions. Do I see any hands? Going once.
Okay, so for next time, for next time, if anybody is interested, I recommend that you have a chance, look this up, on the browser on your computer. Look up Sir Walter Scott, who's the author. Ivanhoe is the novel, so that you have a sense of what the novel is, and then we'll talk about what the movie is too.
Actually, Judy raised her hand. I didn't see her.
Just go ahead and tell them again about the change for next month.
Yes. All right. So next month we're departing. Well, there's several months where we're slightly departing from the schedule, because even this month we did not have the movie on the first Tuesday and then the lecture on the second. So we vary it a little bit. Eventually we'll get into that drift of showing the movie on the first Tuesday of the month and the lecture on the second. Next month we throw in a double confusion, which however is because there were already other events scheduled. So we will have the movie on a Wednesday night, Wednesday the 15th of October, but then the lecture will stay on the Tuesday night. That will be on Tuesday the 21st of October. So the 15th, a Wednesday for the movie, the 21st, the Tuesday for the lecture. Ivanhoe, so it will be a great movie. I think it's available also online, but we will have it here, so we will always show the movie beforehand. Well, let's give a round of applause for our Rabbi.
Okay, have a good month. There's the
Thank you. And I'll stop this also.